All right, welcome to Full Momentum and HEC-RAS Vodcast. My name is Ben Cary, and here as always with me today is Chris Goodell. Chris, welcome to Episode 8 of the Full Momentum Vodcast.
Thanks, Ben. Can't believe we're already at Episode 8. It's going by really quick.
It is. We've tackled a number of really cool stories and topics, and the cool and kind of crazy thing about HEC-RAS is looking forward, it almost seems like there's going to be an unlimited number of these things just because there's so many topics to cover, even in the current version, let alone when one comes out. So
yeah, I was thinking about something recently that there's probably a lot of folks out there who are tuning in who have questions and ideas and thoughts about HEC-RAS, and we ought to get them involved. So if you've got a question, if you've got some topic you're interested in or a specific problem with HEC-RAS, go ahead and leave it in the comments below, or email us at HECRAS@kleinschmidtgroup.com. That's HEC-RAS at kleinschmidtgroup.com. And we'll try and get you guys involved too, and see if we can maybe help some people out.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I would say that would go for any type of question, whether it's just a really short, quick question, or if it's maybe more of an in-depth topic that we need to tackle. Obviously, if it's a longer topic, that'll have to be built into kind of our list down the road of topics that we handle. But especially if it's like a really quick question or something you're curious about, or a specific feature that you have a question about, add those to, like Chris said, add those to the comments or send us an email about those. And I think those would be great to try to answer during these podcasts, so we can make it feel a little bit more like there's some participation with the audience. So
yeah, make sure you give a little context. If you send an email and you say, "My model's crashing, tell me why," we're probably not going to be able to help you too much. But give us a little detail, but not too much. We don't want to read a novel either. So keep it brief, but we'd love to get you guys involved.
That's what you're used to, Chris, is me shooting you an email and saying, "Chris, my model's crashing. Why is it happening?" But
yeah,
anywho,
I wish I would know the answer to that every time. But,
you do
need a little more information. Yeah.
No doubt, no doubt. Hey, before we get started today, I just wanted to give a heads up to folks that are observing this and maybe are watching closely. You'll notice that partway through this video, there's a transition where Chris and I change shirts. My beard gets longer, my hair gets longer, and that's because we had an issue with the recording last time, and so we lost the front half of our presentation. And so we're re-recording the intro here, and then we're going to merge that with the video from last time. So don't be spooked if you see that sudden change in our appearance.
Hey, but you know what? Maybe the wardrobe change should be a thing. Halfway through we switch shirts and just mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, and I know my wife was excited about me getting rid of the beard, but if you feel differently, leave that in the comments. let us know what you thought.
I like the beard, but you look much younger, Ben, without it. So
yeah,
I'll let you decide.
Cool. Well, we got a really cool show today. We're going to cover. We're going to get in depth on a really cool topic, and that's going to be Mannings roughness for 2D models, and specifically in 2D areas. In the previous podcast, episode 7, we talked about Mannings roughness in 1D models and kind of how that all works, how to apply and edit 1D Mannings values to 1D cross sections, different references. Today, we're going to get in depth into how to add and edit Mannings roughness for a 2D model within your 2D areas. But before we get into that, we have a really cool topic for today, and it's not really a news topic, more of just a really interesting kind of out-of-the-box application of HEC-RAS that Chris Goodell has worked on started on it a number of years ago, and kind of has periodically made updates to it, and has had an opportunity to present on this too. It's a topic that's really cool, specifically for those folks that are in the know when it comes to the Northwest and the geography around here, because it was a really, really important event that really changed a lot of the topography in the inland Northwest, particularly, and in the Columbia Gorge as well. And that is the Missoula Floods. So without further ado, Chris, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And you're absolutely right. If you live in this area, in the Portland area, or along the Columbia River or Eastern Washington, you know all about the Missoula floods. It's a very important geologic event or events that have really shaped a lot of what we see on an everyday basis out here. But what's particularly interesting about it to folks like us is that it was a massive flood. In fact, one of the largest floods to ever occur on planet Earth. And it happened about between 10 and 40,000 years ago in the last ice age. And it all started with a reservoir that was formed by an ice dam up in the panhandle of Idaho and in western Montana. And this lake was enormous, and eventually that ice dam failed, and it caused that flood that we're going to talk about here in a second. But back then in the last ice age, most of the northern U.S. was covered with glaciers, and that includes the northwest of the U.S. In fact, a lot of the northern parts of Washington State and Idaho had glaciers that were hundreds and hundreds of feet thick that blanketed the area. And whenever one of those things crossed a river, it would block it and it would dam it. And if there was no other way for that river to reroute, it would form a big lake. And that's what a glacial lake is. And so that's what this discussion is all about. It's the glacial lake that formed behind this ice dam and was called glacial, or is called Glacial Lake Missoula, and then the floods that resulted when that ice dam failed. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to past Ben and past Chris when we recorded this a couple days ago. So you'll see a little bit of a blip as I get kind of back into my discussion, but this is about where I left it off. So hope you all enjoy, and as always, leave comments below. Let us know what you think about this, but also about our discussion that's going to follow on 2D N values. Here's the ice dam right here, and this came down right in the panhandle of the state of Idaho and blocked the Clark Fork River, which created the glacial Lake Missoula that you see right here. Now, when this thing failed, it sent a torrent. I mean, the amount of water that came through these channeled scablands and actually created the scablands were about 10 times the volume of all the rivers in the world today, all at once through this small area in eastern Washington, including Spokane, Ben. So you guys are watching a basketball game at the time, it would have been bad news for you.
And my understanding is that is part of the way that I guess it contributed to the depth of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Is that correct? Because it more or less scoured out a large chunk of that.
You probably went there a lot, right? That's where you guys would go on the weekends and have your parties, right? There's another lake here right where the ice dam was called Lake Pend Oreille. And Lake Pend Oreille is also a very, very deep lake. And this was where the breach happened. And those of you who do breach modeling know that at the breach location and just downstream, you can get a really big scour hole, right? Well, this is an enormous scour hole on epic proportions, right? When you have 10 times the volume of all the rivers in the world coming through this small area at once, you can imagine the scour potential there, right?
Yeah.
And it even scoured out.
D50 is not going to protect your channel.
No, and it's funny you mentioned the D50 because there's a lot of sediment movement through here, and you have evidence of that all over the place through these scablands. You have these big piles of boulders that are pushed off to the side of the valleys. And I'll get to this later, but it even a very interesting component to this is how it transported giant boulders down as far as Eugene, Oregon, which is way down here. And I'll show you those in a second. But basically, this is the path of the flood wave, and here, or the floodway, and here's the Columbia River Gorge right here. Here's Portland, where Ben and I are right now doing this vodcast. And so this is something that interested me from the very beginning when I first read about it. Being a water resources engineer and a hydraulic modeler, I thought, boy, I wonder if you could even model this in HEC-RAS. And this was well before 2D ever came out. So I went on the process of trying to build a 1D HEC-RAS model to simulate this flood. And it was not easy. to say the least. But here's a close-up view of the ice dam and what is now modern day Lake Pend Oreille. Here's Spokane right here, and you can see how the flood would have just come right down here and just blown right through the location of Spokane.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some cool features if you're ever out in that area. Well, first of all, look at this sign right here. This is the highest level of Lake Missoula, and look at the town down there of St. Ignatius, Montana. And you can get a perspective of how deep this lake was. In fact, the lake was so big, volume-wise, it was about half of Lake Michigan, or about Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. 950 feet deep at Missoula. And in fact, if you ever get out to Missoula, Montana, and you look around the hillsides, you can see the lakeshore remnants on the hillsides. Each of these lines represent a different lake level that paused periodically, and just the wave action would kind of erode these lines in the hills. And it was a mystery for the longest time. People had no idea why these lines were here and how they could be so perfectly horizontal until the mystery was solved of the Missoula Floods, which wasn't until just recently. And this was led by a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz out of the University of Chicago. And he came out to Eastern Washington, was fascinated by the scablands out there. And back in 1923, we didn't have aerial imagery to see these features. So he was interpreting everything from the ground level. I think he might have gotten in an airplane a few times, but generally he was at ground level, and he saw these features that were way larger than they look like they should be. There were little tiny trickles of a stream going through, but the feature was so large that it looked like there must have been a massive river there at one point, and nobody really knew what caused that. But he came up with this theory of the floods, and he called them the Spokane floods, which is another name for it. We call them the Missoula floods as well. But he was immediately rejected from the geologic community, and this is a really good lesson for everybody out there that don't necessarily reject theories that sound unreasonable, because you never know. I mean, you need to look at things closely and examine and take a really unbiased look. But back then everything was very biased. They looked at geology through the lens of uniformitarianism, which is a hard word to say, but it was also a belief that everything we see in geology happened over millions of years, and that is the case with a lot of it. But there were some of these events that were very quick and brief and did a lot of change of geometry in a very short period of time, and that was the Missoula floods. And he proposed that theory, I think, well, he first started viewing the scablands in 1923, and it wasn't until 1965 that the geologic community actually embraced J. Harlan Bretz, and he actually won the highest medal you can win in geology in 1979. What's the highest medal we can win in hydraulic engineering or hydraulic modeling, Ben? Because I'd like to know.
I think it's being a guest on our podcast.
Hey, there you go. All right. Cool. So just some examples of striking features around the Northwest. This is Dry Falls right here, and it's 5 times wider than Niagara Falls. There's just a little relative trickle of water that spills in here. And when you look at it, both in the aerial view, but in person, it's hard to imagine what could create such a thing. And then if you do some more exploration around, you see these ripple patterns, but these are ripple patterns that are on an enormous scale. First of all, you can see them in aerial imagery. You guys, everybody out there watching this, you can get on Google Earth and just dial into this area, the West Bar area of Washington, and look at the Columbia River here and these ripple patterns you see on this point bar. And you get an appreciation.
This is the feature I'm most familiar with when it comes to Missoula floods, because it's one of those things where if you're driving through Eastern Washington, you won't notice it. It just kind of looks like rolling hills. There's nothing necessarily that stands out. But when you get in an airplane and you fly from Seattle to Spokane, it looks like, the tide flats of a sandy beach as
It
far as the
does.
ripple patterns. And at that point, it's very easy to understand that there was a lot of water moving over here at some point. And like
Yeah.
when you get the scale of the Columbia River, you understand that, hey, and the example you're showing there, the West Bar, that's relatively close to the Columbia, right? So maybe you could
Yeah.
infer that there was the Columbia was a lot larger at some point, and maybe it flooded over there. It's like, okay, well, that's a little bit. You can see these ripple patterns in the middle of nowhere, well away from the Columbia River, and that is a real sign of like, hey, there was something that happened here,
Yeah.
that isn't necessarily associated with just a flood of the Columbia. So that's pretty cool.
That's right. And look at this boat down here
Hmm.
imaged for scale. And these are the
Yeah.
ripples that you see here. These are the same exact kind of ripples you see, like you said, Ben, on a beach as the water recedes, or
Yep.
in a sandbed stream. And these are enormous, 50 feet high, wavelengths of up to 500 feet. I mean, no one's ever seen anything like that, or at least
Hmm.
back then when J. Harlan Bretz was exploring the area. And so all these little puzzle pieces work together. Here's one like you were mentioning, out in the middle of nowhere, right? Some
Hmm.
ripple patterns, and here you
Hmm.
can see a truck driving through the middle of it on a highway. So that's
Hmm.
another example, and you can see that from aerial photography. Um, and then this was what I was getting at before, these ice rafted erratics. So as I mentioned, the dam was an ice dam, right? And it was formed by a glacier. And this glacier, as it moved and advanced southwards, it picked up rocks as it went,
Hmm.
giant rocks, and entrained them inside of the glacier. And when the ice dam broke, it broke into all sorts of pieces, little icebergs, and they all floated downstream. Some of these icebergs actually had giant rocks embedded in them, and they floated these rocks downstream, and
Hmm.
they would settle out in some backwater area and fall out and end up melting, and then left behind was this rock that was sitting in the middle of a field. It just was out of place. There was no reason for it to be there. And furthermore, scientists start to figure out that, hey, the composition of these rocks, the mineral makeup, is not anything we have around this area. How is it possible? And then they start figuring out, well, it's the same kind of rock you have in Montana.
Hmm.
And yeah, talk about scratching your head. And for a long time, people thought these rocks were put here by aliens, or they were meteorites or something like that. And
Sure.
is just, again, another piece of the puzzle. Here's a really good example of an ice rafted erratic on the side of this highway, and you can even see it from Google Earth right here. You can see a bunch
Hmm.
of other erratics in this field, and farmers don't even deal with them. They just they just plant their crops around these erratics and just go around them. They just deal with it. If
Hmm.
you look at the here's a map of the greater Portland area, and all these triangles you see here are all identified erratics. Now they're harder to find in the Portland area because we have a lot of vegetation, so you've got trees and bushes and grass growing over some of these, and they've been weathered, some of them a lot, so some don't even exist anymore. This is a really good example of an erratic that you can go to. These are my girls. Several years ago, we did a hike up to this, and perfect example. It's a great place to go to. It's in the middle of wine country, so you can go look at the erratic and then go have some wine too at a really good winery somewhere. So here's how I set up the model. This is just the terrain that I used. And when I first did this, I did it in 1D because I mentioned earlier we didn't have 2D and HEC-RAS back then. And computing power was a lot less than what we have on our typical computers today as well. And so I had to really manage the size of this terrain and keep it small and keep it efficient. And so I used 30-meter resolution, or sorry, 130 horizontal resolution. This came from the 1-degree DEM USGS aerosite, and converted that to an Esri grid, and then used that to cut my cross sections. And the hard part, at least originally, I thought the hard part was going to be, how do I set this model up? There were so many different flood paths, and I can imagine I'm going to have a lot of junctions, a lot of diversions, a lot of lateral structures, which was true. But my original worry that it was going to be hard to figure out how to set this up was overcome pretty quickly when you look at the aerial imagery, because you can see in the scablands, at least, the flood path still. Everybody get on Google Earth, zoom into Eastern Washington. You can see these flood paths from the Google or from the Missoula floods. Okay. And so these were where I drew my flow lines. So it made it actually very easy to set up the model, relatively
No,
speaking,
I
we
wouldn't
can
say
say.
very easy.
Well,
That's a
easier than I thought it would be. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point, Ben. And here's what it ended up looking like. These are all my cross sections and my reaches and rivers. And in total, I had 2,346 cross sections when you count up all of the interpolated ones. These just show the uninterpolated cross sections. And 68 reaches, 34 junctions, 36 external boundaries. That was one of the harder parts, was to figure out what amount of flow was I going to put in each of these different external boundary conditions. So I got onto USGS and looked at gauges and tried to get an idea of base flow amounts, and that's what I put in there. But a lot of it really, Ben, was trying to stabilize this thing. And this was the biggest time investment of putting this together, was stabilizing this model. And this wasn't something I was doing for work. So this was on my own time, which meant I was doing an hour or two in the evenings and some time on the weekends. And all told, it probably took a couple of months to get this model put together and stabilized. And again, that was just, an hour here, hour there. So usually I would come home from work and I would make a little change to try and overcome an instability, and I'd run the model and let it run overnight and then see how it turned out the next day. So here's another look at the model with the interpolated cross sections. You can see I've got some inline structures in here. If you zoom in closer, some lateral structures as well. At a 30-second time step, and was running it for 21 days. And with the size of this model, you can imagine it takes a long time to run, which it did. It did, for sure. And I had to set up a hot start too. That was the only way I could get this thing stable for initial conditions. But so anyway, fast forward to a few years ago, when 2D came out in HEC-RAS, I decided, hey, we need to set this up as a 2D model, because obviously you look around here and all these different flow paths. This is very much a two-dimensional example. So let me show you what I put together recently, relatively recently. And here is the same location, and I've got a giant, actually two different 2D areas. There's one downstream of the ice dam and one upstream, which represents the Lake Missoula. And once I had this 2D area drawn in here, this thing ran almost immediately. I had a few errors to work out, but there were no instability problems because I had my Courant numbers correct.
Yeah, huge cells.
Huge cells, yes, huge cells for sure, which allowed me to have a bigger time step, so this thing could run in a reasonable amount of time. It took, I want to say it takes about a couple hours to run. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly, but it ran the first time. It was so exciting because it took me literally a couple months of running and rerunning the 1D model, and this thing went in right away. And, of course, I made some tweaks and improved it and everything. But let me show you the animation of this because it's super cool. So here we see the state of Washington. This is Idaho, Montana over here where the lake is. And then Oregon down here. Here's Portland where we're sitting, Ben. And if I go ahead and animate this, this is our 2D model. It's really cool. Look at the hot spot there right at the breach. And here it is, heading its way down to Gonzaga. Watch out.
Run to the South Hill.
That's right. And it's going down the Spokane River here, and eventually it will tie into the Columbia at Lake Roosevelt, which is what's backed up behind Grand Coulee today.
Well, the interesting thing here is too, is you can see that it's following the river, but it's also bypassing the river and just blowing through the Palouse and that whole the scablands there. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, because the water got so deep here, it actually spilled over the edge. This is all the Columbia and the Spokane. This is all through a canyon, but you've got some flat land here. And back before these floods, it was all fertile silt there. Hundreds of feet thick of silt. And that all got scoured out to leave behind what we have now, which are the scablands there.
Yeah.
But,
well, it's interesting too, because Oregon benefited from this pretty mightily, because we took a lot of that topsoil and it got deposited in the Willamette Valley, which is part of the reason why the Willamette Valley has some of the best soil for agricultural purposes in
That's
the whole
right.
region. So
Yeah, in fact, there's some really great wine areas too, viticultural areas. You've got the Willamette Valley AVA here. You've got Columbia River AVA. Walla Walla right here has great wines. Look at Walla Walla right here. This is a
mhm.
backwater area. All of this silt got dumped right here.
Yep.
Got dumped right here. Up here in the Yakima Valley, where they have great orchards of apples and
Hmm.
pears and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, here you can see it's still moving down the Columbia River Gorge, just about to get into Portland. I'm going to zoom
Yeah.
in here.
Do you want to fast forward a little bit, Chris? Because I think it's like 15-minute or 5-minute time steps it's showing right now. So.
Yeah, let's do that. But let me get it into Portland here a little bit. And here are the Willamette Valley vineyards, right? In
Hmm.
the Chehalem Valley here. So, and you can pause this and we can take a look at the particle tracing too and zoom in. Um, Notice where these funnels are right here, these
Hmm.
jets. You can actually drive out there, Ben, today, and you can see the carving that was done in these areas. This is Lake Oswego, which is actually was formed by this event.
Hmm.
And here's on the Willamette River, and if you look around Oregon City, you can see these basalt cliffs around Oregon City. Even over here, there's some scablands further over. Actually, right here, the Tonkin scablands. You can see some features there as well. So anyway, this is it. All told, it took about 21 days for the flood to finally recede and drain out to the Pacific Ocean. And you
Hmm.
can see too, went all the way as far south as Eugene, Oregon. And so
Hmm.
you even see some erratics down there as well. So
Yeah. Pretty
yeah,
wild stuff. Well, so
yeah,
Chris, what was the final? One of the cool features I've seen you show is the final inundation map compared to what is basically mapped by geologists, and how well that overlaid.
yeah. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to turn on the max water surface right
And
here.
yeah, go ahead and turn on the water surface with the depth so it's easier to see, because the velocity is kind of
Yeah, you're right.
messy.
So here's the max water surface depth, and let's see if I can go back to my PowerPoint, and we'll go up to this first slide here. Here is the flood
Hmm.
that geologists think happened, and here's how mine turned out. So it's pretty close, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You
it
see
looks
a
very
lot of
similar.
these islands here show up there as well.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah, that's a really cool application, Chris. This is, I think, one of those things that shows that RAS is really capable of modeling almost anything. It's just a matter of, knowing how to stabilize your model. Obviously, one of the limitations of this model is, I think you had like 500-foot cells or something like that. So there's no way that you were going to be able to do any type of, detailed site-specific analysis with this model. But for the purpose of it, which is simulating one of the largest dam breaches in the history of the Earth, it works fine, right? I mean, so
yeah.
this is one of those things to pay attention to. It's really important to ask yourself, what is the purpose of my model, and
Hmm.
is the cell size and time step that I've chosen appropriate for that? In this case, totally, absolutely is. But probably wouldn't want to do a bridge scour analysis on the Columbia River for this. So.
No, but here's the cool thing is you can take this model and you can use it as boundary conditions for little small pieces. Like I
Yeah.
can build my own, I could build a separate 2D model of just the Portland area, maybe carve out here and maybe right here or a little further down, make this its own 2D model with much smaller cells, and then use the bigger model to inform the boundary conditions. And I've actually done some of that already. I want to do a lot more of it so you can get a really good picture of the flow patterns and depths and velocities, shear stresses that were going on through here. It's pretty
Yeah,
impressive.
very cool.
So,
Thanks for sharing that, Chris.
Of course,
Um,
yeah. And one quick thing too is I give a presentation on this too, and I've done probably, a dozen or more of these. So always happy to share more detail about this event and the model and what you can get out of the model. If anybody's interested in seeing a presentation, let me know.
Great. Very, very cool. All right. Well, before we move into our technical HEC-RAS topic for today, I just wanted to take the time to thank our sponsor for this episode. And our sponsor, as always, is our engineering firm, Klein Schmidt Associates, who is known throughout the industry as a firm that provides practical solutions to complex problems affecting energy, water, and the environment. You can learn more at kleinschmidtgroup.com. And at kleinschmidtgroup.com, there's also an advertisement for our fall HEC-RAS class, which will be taking place for 6 weeks from October 7th to November 11th. It's 1 4-hour webinar session a week, plus workshops in between the lectures. We just finished our first class a couple weeks ago. It went very well. We got a lot of great feedback. Chris and I felt good about how the in-person curriculum transferred to online curriculum. In some ways, there was actually some benefits. There was a number of folks that commented that they really felt like they were able to retain the information better because they were diving into the material for 6 weeks as opposed to 3 days. And so definitely encourage everybody who enjoys these vodcasts, who wants to learn more, who wants to take their HEC-RAS game to the next level. This is kind of a fun project and something fun for HEC-RAS users to pay attention to and to get a thing or two here or there to up their HEC-RAS game. But if you really want to take your modeling expertise to the next level, I think Chris and I would both say it's really important to take a class like this.
Yeah, you'll get
it's a very similar format. It's Chris and I just going back and forth talking about. It's more structured, but talking about HEC-RAS topics, answering questions, going through workshops. It's a really great exercise.
It's a deeper dive, right, Ben? I mean, we go into more topics, but we go deeper into it. We get into theory, and we get into and you get to do workshops too, where we're there to help you through it and guide you and talk about them afterwards. So it's a great opportunity, and we have a lot of fun too. If you didn't make the first one, there's plenty of time to sign up for the next one. So I hope to see you guys there.
Yep. And again, you guys can find the ad and the pre-sign up on our LinkedIn pages, Ben, Cary, and Chris Goodell, or at kleinschmidtgroup.com.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into the technical topic for today. And we're going to talk about Manning's roughness values in 2D models in HEC-RAS. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here as I kind of give a little bit of introduction. So for those of you guys who were able to see our previous episode, we talked about Manning's roughness for 1D models. And in some ways, there's a little bit more customization, and it can be a little bit more complicated working with Mannings in 1D. Obviously, you can assign cross sections to or individual Mannings values to individual cross sections. The bigger the model you have, the more Manning adjustments you might have to do. You might have to adjust the location of your left overbank and your right overbank and your channel. There's a lot of customization that can potentially need to go on. With 2D, it's pretty easy. It's very quick to set up. It's nice because you can have a very spatially varied Manning's end layer that's associated with your 2D mesh, and we're going to talk about kind of how that works right now. So this is RAS Mapper. Everyone should be familiar with this tool by now. Obviously, one of the things Chris and I always say, when you start a new project, you want to add a projection file to your project. You want to bring in aerial imagery, and then you're going to add your terrain. So this project already has the terrain in here. The next thing that Chris and I always suggest people do is to bring in a Manning's end layer. And the way that you do that is you go to Tools, New Land Cover, okay, and then you're going to get an option to pop up here that looks like this, and you're going to have the option to add a Manning's end value layer, okay? And this is going to be, most of the time, the format for this is going to be a shape file, but you can also add a TIFF or an image file that represents your Manning's end values for your 2D project area. And there's really two ways to add a Manning's end layer. One would be to add in a general land classification database, something that's publicly available something like the NLCD database. Let me pull up a presentation that Chris and I give. Is actually part of our class here. So this is an example of the NLCD database. You can see that it's a nationwide database of land cover in the United States, and it's often what HEC-RAS users use to bring in as a Mannings and layer. The problem with this is you can see it's pretty coarse, and so you're not going to have a lot of detail when it comes to around your channel itself. So you can see here the blue is the channel in this case, and you can actually see that there's some gaps in the channel, and so you would transition from one Mannings layer to another in the same channel. And so this is going to give you, this is going to create some issues, especially if you're going to be doing some near field study or some design for a specific location. So if you're doing that, what Chris and I would recommend, instead of using like a national database like this, would be to create your own Mannings and layer. And this is something you can do in GIS and then bring in as a shapefile into Mannings. And again, the way you would do that is either go under Tools, New Land Cover, or you can come into Map Layers, right-click on Map Layers, and add New Manning End Layer. It's a little bit confusing because this option and New Land Cover are both are the same thing. They just have two different names there. So a little tricky thing there to understand, but
just to confuse you guys.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I would say that more often than not, what Chris and I do is we actually would just create our own Mannings end layer for our project. So if we're doing a project that's just in this area here, that's easy enough to spend a few hours and discretize our own land use shapefile. Maybe you'd have a value to represent your channel, maybe some areas that represent like if we turn on the aerial imagery here and zoom in to this area, you can see looks like we have like a reservoir area and some river channel, and then we have some overbank areas that represent some heavily forested areas, as well as some open space and some rural residential. So you could discretize all of this with a simple shapefile. We usually don't go to the level where you're actually discretizing individual homes, but you can do that as well, depending on, again, the level of your analysis that you're doing. But when you discretize that and you have your shapefile that represents your Mannings end values, again, you do that by coming in here, adding new Mannings end layer. You choose a specific layer. Okay, so in this case, what I'll do is I'll navigate to a sample here. Let's go to GIS. Let's try this. Okay, and then you'll get these different options. So you'll see here. In this case, I don't have any. There's not multiple Mannings and shapes in this shape file, and so I only have one option. But you can see, you can select the naming fields. You can customize which field you want to be represented for your Mannings end layer, and then you can actually customize the individual Manning values for each type of shapefile. And so if you had multiple shapefiles, those would all show up here, and you could manually add in what you want your Mannings end layer to be. The other option that Chris is going to talk about here in a second is using override regions. And so I'll let Chris dive into that in a second. But once you have the Mannings layer brought in to your HEC-RAS project, you have to associate that Mannings end layer, just like you have to associate a terrain layer with a specific geometry. You can do that by clicking on the terrain, manage terrain associations. And then if we look at this dialog box, you can see that each one of my geometries has a terrain that I associate with it, as well as a Mannings end layer, okay? And if you don't have your Mannings end layer associated with the geometry, or if you don't have a Mannings end layer brought into your project, period, you will not be able to use override regions, which is what Chris is going to talk about right now.
Yeah, so Ben mentioned the shapefiles that you can bring in to be your land cover. There's also a really simple way to do end values too, and that's to apply a single end value for the entire 2D area, and that's done right here in the 2D area editor. But the third option, as Ben introduced here, is the refinement regions, which I'm going to talk about now. But the only way you can use a refinement region is if you already have a land cover layer established and associated with this geometry file. So you can double check on that by going into RAS Mapper. And let me me get into RAS Mapper here really quick. It's thinking. Okay, so here you can see my land cover layer, and I've got it highlighted right here. Oops, highlighted over here, which means since it's highlighted, if I hover over, I can see the different N values associated with it. So that's really cool. But to check that it's associated, just right click on the geometries label, go to Manage Geometry Associations, and then make sure you've got, oops.
Probably on a different screen, Chris.
Yeah, you're right, it is. There we go. Okay, so just make sure that you've got your land classification right here established for each of the geometries you want to use it. Now, once you have that, that unlocks the ability to use these refinement regions. And the reason the refinement regions are here—
override regions, right, Chris?
Yeah, same thing. Oh no, you're right. Override regions, yes, sorry. Don't confuse that with the refinement regions. Yes, override regions. Okay, the reason we have these override regions are, well, they were initially put in so that you would have a way to calibrate. So you run your model and you see, oh, my depths are a little bit too high over here, but they're a little low on this side. Well, what I could do is I can make a region over here and another one over here, and those regions, then I can adjust the base level N values to something different to try to calibrate my results. And so if you go back to the geometry window, you can see I've got some regions in here. They're very small. Let me zoom in. Now, in this case, I'm using regions to, yeah, you can't even see them because of the mesh here, but I'm using regions in these little refinement regions. I've got some override regions as well. I'm using those to simulate what's called a large wood structure in the river. It's a restoration element that's commonly used here in the Northwest and around, probably around the world too, but great way to provide some habitat and some grade control as well. But this is going to have a much higher N value, right? And so instead of going back and making a new land cover, I can just simply click this 2D area, regions, Mannings N regions, override regions, and I can draw in an override region where I'd like to have one. Okay, just give it a name, OR6. Okay, and there's another override region. Now, with that override region, these other ones in here, the ability to make N value changes is very easy. All you have to do is go into the tables menu item, go down to your Mannings N by land cover, and here you can see your land cover table. Now, the way this table works, let me scrunch it up a little bit here, is you've got your base N values or your default N values right here. And these are what come out of your land cover layer. Okay, we've got an N value of 10 for buildings, 0.12 for medium density residential, et cetera, all the way down. Okay, now for these override regions, each override region you've drawn in your geometry, you've got a column for that override region. Here are the 5 that were already in there at the beginning. This is the one I just created. And let's say that, you know, in that particular region, I'm doing some work there. It's going to be pretty maybe graded out and just a bunch of dirt, okay? So I might want to just force an N value anywhere that region exists of 0.04, okay? And I can copy that, paste it all the way down. Okay, so now anywhere where that override region exists, the N value will automatically be 0.04. Okay, no matter what it was over here, it's going to override that with 0.04. So that's another example of how to use these override regions, is just to provide a specific N value, maybe for a proposed condition. Like in this case, this is a restoration site, and I've got my existing conditions set with my land cover layer, but my proposed conditions I'm going to define with these refinement regions. Okay, and so that's just that's the third way of doing n values. And the cool thing is you can do this right in the geometry window. You don't have to create a separate layer or anything. That's done for you. But you can also set up regions, refinement regions, in the in RAS Mapper. Let me pull up RAS Mapper. So we're back in RAS Mapper. If I go up to geometries and notice under this particular geometry, the ELJs, I've got a Mannings N group. If I expand that, then you'll see override regions. So just like any other geometrical layer, input layer, I can right click and I can edit that, and that will allow me to draw some more regions in here. Here you can see the regions I already have.
Yep.
I can just draw some more if I'd like to. Save that and they'll show up in the geometry window.
You can also right click on that override regions, Chris, right now, and go to open attribute table. And once you have those drawn in, this is where you can actually add those n values in as well.
Right.
So,
Yeah, good point. So there's a lot of overlap between doing these in RAS Mapper or the geometry. So for now, do whichever one makes sense to you, whatever you're more comfortable with. I think ultimately you're probably going to be doing this in RAS Mapper or something similar to RAS Mapper in the future.
yeah. And Chris had a good point that I've neglected to touch on, and that was before you even bring in a Mannings layer, your 2D area does have a default Mannings N value, and what that is based on when you create a 2D layer. So in this case, under 2D flow areas, perimeters, I have a 2D layer. For instance, here you right click on this, and I'm in RAS Mapper, edit the 2D flow area properties. And you'll see you define your cell sizes, but you define your default Mannings N value. So this will be the default Mannings N value for every single cell face within your 2D mesh, unless you specify or bring in a Mannings N layer and use override regions. So a lot of times when you're just initially setting up a model, you don't actually need to go through and bring in a Mannings N layer. Maybe you just want to use just the default Mannings, and you just want to get the model running, making sure everything's looking okay, and then you can add more detail. Again, that's one of our secrets for success is start simple, add more detail where it's needed.
Yeah, and let me make a quick point here, Ben, before you continue on, because this is a question I get all the time, and that is, how are the n values applied on the mesh? And the way it works is you get one n value per cell face.
Yep.
Okay, and the n value that gets applied to the entire cell face is the n value that the center of that cell falls within. So
Yep.
if you look at the center of the cell face, sorry, the cell face, if you look at the center of the cell face, yeah, right there you can see that it's close to the blue or the green. It's hard to
I think
tell.
it's the
Probably
I think it would
blue.
be the blue in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that blue n value now is going to be applied to the entire cell face, even though half of it is green, whatever
Yep.
the number is. I can't quite see the number there, but so that's something that's very important for you to know. And if that's going to have an effect on your results, you're going to want to put a break line maybe right down there,
Yep.
so that you have a separate face on either side of that n value classification boundary.
Yeah, that's really good, Chris. So in the same line on this cell face here, the center of this cell face is green, so this entire cell face would get the Mannings N value of 0.075 versus this
Right.
cell would get the Mannings N value of 0.035. So this is a disadvantage of having larger cells, right? Because you're not going to
Yeah.
have you're not going to capture the variance as well. But like Chris said, if it's going to cause you big issues, you can add a break line along here so that your cell face ends right at that Mannings N layer, and each cell face
Yeah.
is more representative of the actual area.
Yeah.
The other thing
That's
I was
why
going to
some
show was just
people that's why some people will put break lines along their banks of a river.
yep,
Is
yep,
that's one reason to do that. Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, so the last thing I was going to show was just kind of how this works in practice. So this is a project that I was working on recently, and wanted to have my own customized Mannings N layer. And so these were the steps that I took. So I brought in my terrain, I added a projection file, brought in aerial imagery. And then the first thing I did is I just went to features here. So I didn't even use GIS to do any of this. This was all in RAS Mapper. I drew I went to features, create new layer, polygon layer, and I called it base land cover, base LC. And all it is just a simple rectangle here that's across my entire project area, okay? Once I created that, I right-clicked, exported the layer to a shapefile, okay? And then I was able to bring that in as a Mannings layer because now it's a shapefile. So I came into Tools, Add New Layer, and I added that shapefile in. And this is what it ended up looking like here. So if I, sorry, it's turned off. There we go. So this is what ended up coming in. It was for my Mannings end layers, this rectangle that represents a single Mannings value of 0.075. Okay. So right now this is no better than my default value of 0.06, just a single value for my entire area. But what I did then is I came in and I associated that Mannings end layer with my geometry, and then I drew in multiple override regions that represented my reservoir area, my overbank areas, some heavily forested areas, some open areas, some rural residential areas, and I drew those all in, okay? And then I assigned each of those override regions a Mannings end value. And then when you go ahead and run the pre-processing of your 2D area, how you can see what your final Mannings end values are is under, again, my geometry, the name of my geometry, Mannings end. This shows my location of my override regions. This shows what my final end values are for this model. So you can see I got my 0.075, which is that large rectangle, and then I have my override regions, which represent kind of some of the more fine detail in these different areas here. So this is a good example of a super quick way to do this. It didn't take a ton of time or effort. If I was going to use this model for a detailed hydraulic design in a particular area, I'd probably want some even more refinement. Maybe I would use something like GIS to do some of that processing, but it can be done really quick. And what you end up with is a spatially varied Mannings end layer for a 2D model, which is pretty slick.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, to unlock the ability to use the override regions, you have to draw in, even just a very simple rectangular land cover layer like you did there, Ben. So that's a really cool application. And this would be great if you have maybe your 2D area is the majority a single end value, but you just have a few little areas here and there. Then you could quickly just put some refinement regions on there. And so really cool technique.
Yeah, we just have a few more minutes here, Chris, but I wanted to just briefly touch on some of the challenges that are associated with Mannings end values for 2D models. Obviously, with 1D models and 1D cross sections, you have some tools that you're available to you that allow you to account for maybe depth varied Mannings end or horizontally varied Mannings end. And you don't have that same option for Mannings end. So what do you think some of the big limitations are for 2D Mannings end values? One thing that stands out to me immediately is when you're doing any type of rain on grid modeling, right? You can't do rain on grid in 1D. We talk about rain on grid in 2D in our class. And one of the limitations there is many of your cells are going to have very, very shallow depths. And so having a Mannings end value of 0.075 for forested areas might be totally reasonable for a flood event and a floodplain. But when you're talking about depths that are less than an inch, that seems like it's way too small.
Yeah, you picked up on it. That's exactly right. And that vertical variation in end values, especially when you have really, really shallow depths and depths that are on the same order of magnitude as the roughness elements themselves. So like a blade of grass, for example, if the water is flowing through the blades of grass, that roughness is very high. And if you were to ever look at a relationship between Mannings end roughness and depth, you'll see as the depth decreases, you get a really steep increase in end values at some point. And so it usually looks something like this. So like if I got my chart here and this is end value, no, sorry, this is depth. And this is my end value here. Usually you get something like this, a pretty constant end value at higher depths. And then as it gets lower and lower, it does something like this, right? And this is the zone where you're in sheet flow, right? And you've got water about the same order of magnitude and depth as the roughness elements. Unfortunately, in the current version of RAS, we can't simulate this with our end value. You only get one end value for the entire range of depths,
Mhm.
right? And so we can't do that in the current version. Future versions will allow for that. So what you have to do is you have to identify these areas. Is it going to be primarily sheet flow?
Yep.
Especially if you're doing rain on grid. And if it is, then you need to elevate those N values. Otherwise, you're going to have velocities that are too high and depths that are too low. Water's going to move through that area faster than it's supposed to. And so
Yeah. It can
calibrating
really,
is a very powerful way to figure this out.
yeah, that can really, not only can that jack up the results as far as the velocities and depths, but it can throw off your timing. If
Yeah.
you're, simulating a large basin, the time that it takes for rain to get from this portion to a river or a town is going to be uh, overly conservative or too fast if you're using kind of just a default Manning's N layer for normal channel flow. So,
Yeah.
like Chris said,
Yeah.
I think this is definitely more of an issue for rain on grid modeling, in which case you need to identify those areas and maybe use an artificially higher Manning's N value for the areas that are getting mostly sheet flow. But even
Yeah.
some of the areas where you have really shallow backwater or really shallow depths in your floodplain, you might have to take into account, maybe I need to use a slightly higher Manning's N value for those.
Yeah, and just keep in mind the N values that are in the publications that we mentioned in the last podcast, publications like Barnes or Chow or Hicks and Mason, those are all created for flood conditions or higher depths. And so those N values are more appropriate for rivers and floodplains where you've got appreciable water moving over them. They're not necessarily going to apply for really shallow depths in a 2D sense. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind too, the 2D equations actually take into account some of the features that are lumped into the N values that you see in these books, like turbulence losses. Okay, that's something that's not explicitly computed when they're defining the N values from those resources, but we have that built into the equation. So in theory, our 2D Manning's N values should be a little bit less
Hmm.
than what you're getting out of those publications. Now, in practice, what you're going to do is you're going to use those N values if you've got normal depths of flow anyway, and you might back them off a little bit based on your engineering judgment, but in reality, the calibration effort is going to cover that range of uncertainty. So that's just another plug for doing a calibration effort on your model, because there's a lot more uncertainty with the 2D N values than with 1D for sure.
Yep. Very, very good. All
Yeah,
right, Chris. Well, before we
good
take
talk.
off for the day, anything else that you want to add?
No, I think we did a good job. A really quick overview of 2D N values. Again, we take a much deeper dive in the online training course and the in-person training course. When we get through this COVID thing, we'll be able to do these in person again. But until then, yeah, check out the course. We'll do a much deeper dive into N values and all the other features in building your HEC-RAS models.
Very good. Yeah. Hope many folks can join us. I think we had almost 40 people last time. We'd love to get more than that this time. I think we will. But if you're interested, feel free to ask a question on the comment page of this YouTube video. But go do some research. Look at our LinkedIn posts for some background on that class, and sign up.
Yeah, keep the conversation going in the comments too. Ben and I check these periodically, and if this generated any questions for you, we'd be happy to entertain those.
Awesome.
All
Awesome.
right.
Awesome. All right. Well, Chris, I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
You
Everybody
too,
that's
Ben.
attending this podcast, stay safe, stay healthy. And until next time, this has been Full Momentum and HEC-RAS Podcast.